So can you answer for me if the Secretary of Defense or the President of the United States asks you to put NSA or military intel personnel, people or tools or assets targeted at American citizens who don't have a link to a foreign terrorist organization, will you reject that?
This may look like a routine confirmation exchange, but it's actually a stress test of America's intelligence guardrails. What's really being tested here is whether constitutional limits still hold when political language blurs the line between foreign threats and domestic dissent. This raises broader questions about how surveillance power is defined, who controls it, and what happens when legal authority collides with political pressure. In this video, we'll break down how intelligence tools meant for external defense risk being pulled into internal conflicts and why that distinction is foundational to a constitutional system.
Thank you, Senator Schmidt. Senator Slotkin.
Yes, thank you for being here. Thank you to both of you for the time yesterday or a couple days ago in my little hideaway. General Rudd, we talked about this, but as a former CIA officer who worked alongside NSA, my whole career and proudly participated in operations targeting foreign terrorist organizations, foreign adversaries. I think one of the things I'm concerned about, especially in the last couple of weeks, is any possibility that NSA might be used inappropriately against American citizens. And you know that NSA is governed by the National Security Act of 1947, an Executive Order 12333, and even by FISA law that this body passed in as recently as 2024. And I think this is pretty relevant. We have the Secretary of Homeland Security, Stephen Miller, the Vice President of the United States, labeling people in Minneapolis as domestic terrorists and talking about American citizens as if they are the enemy. So, you're going to be in charge of this incredibly important organization, necessary organization, but you're also going to be the guy in the room. Should there ever be a suggestion that we target American citizens with NSA capabilities? So can you answer for me if the Secretary of Defense or the President of the United States asks you to put NSA or military intel personnel, people or tools or assets targeted at American citizens who don't have a link to a foreign terrorist organization, will you reject that?
Senator, thanks again for the time the other day, and appreciate the opportunity to discuss this very important issue. Senator, if confirmed, I will execute my responsibilities in accordance with the Constitution and all applicable laws.
So we talked about this. There is just a ton of law saying that we cannot wiretap, using the layman's term, American citizens' communications just for expressing their freedom of speech, right? That they have to have a foreign nexus with a terrorist organization or a foreign power. We couldn't be more clear. And as a CIA officer, after coming in years and years after Watergate, that was drilled into us, that we never turn the intelligence community against the American people. So thank you for answering that clearly, because you're going to be the guy in the room, right? We talked about how tough these positions are. Separate from Minneapolis, the president signed an executive order in September asking the Attorney General to come up with a new list of domestic terrorist organizations, and said, once you come up with the list, I want you to use the full weight of the federal government to go after those domestic terrorist groups. And he defined domestic terrorist groups in a very broad way, including groups that are anti-Christian, have anti-American views. Not just violent, which of course we all understand, violence is not legal, but in these very broad terms. She has now started that process. The Attorney General in November made some announcements about that. Can you just help me understand, will NSA be a part, or should they be a part of that interagency team targeting domestic terrorist so-called domestic terrorist organizations?
Senator, I don't know if NSA is or isn't part of that interagency currently. But again, consistent with the last question you just asked, it is our highest duty to uphold our oath to the Constitution and ensure that if confirmed in these roles, we execute those consistent with that oath.
Well, since the organization you're about to take over, if confirmed, has been without a leader since the previous leader was fired, I just ask that you do that looking under the rug and making sure that we are never making American citizens question whether their intelligence community is targeting them. Let me just ask, lastly, General Donovan, I've asked, I think, 14 different military nominees. Again, we hope you will not be asked to do something that's illegal, but given that your predecessor was removed or left very early and allegedly for questions about concerns over the legality of operations, if you're asked to do something illegal or unconstitutional, will you reject that order, push back? You don't have to do it publicly, but push back and protect those who serve under you?
Senator, yes, I will. That's my constitutional responsibility.
Thank you. Yield back.
The moment comes quietly, almost politely, but the weight of it is unmistakable. Senator Slotkin leans in and asks a question that does not sound dramatic on the surface, yet carries the gravity of American history behind it. Will you reject an order to use the intelligence apparatus of the United States against its own citizens? Not in theory, not in abstraction, but if the Secretary of Defense or the President themselves were to ask. In that instant, the hearing room becomes more than a procedural stop on a nomination calendar. It becomes a test of memory, of restraint, and of whether the lessons written into law after past failures still mean something today. This exchange is not about personalities, it is about power. It is about the boundary between national security and constitutional liberty, a line that has been crossed before and one that lawmakers once swore would never be blurred again. Slotkin does not speak as a casual observer. She speaks as someone who worked inside the system alongside the NSA, who understands how immense its reach can be when directed outward, and how dangerous it becomes when turned inward. She reminds the room that the rules are not vague. The National Security Act, Executive Order 12333, FISA. Laws passed not in some distant era, but reaffirmed as recently as 2024. These are not suggestions. They are guardrails. And yet she raises a concern that would not need to be voiced if trust were absolute. The concern that in a charged political climate, definitions can stretch, labels can expand, and citizens can quietly begin to look like threats. When she references senior officials describing Americans as enemies, the temperature shifts. This is no longer a hypothetical. It is a warning. History shows that the most consequential erosion of liberty rarely announces itself with sirens. It happens through language, through reclassification, through the normalization of extraordinary tools being used for ordinary dissent. The nominee's response is careful, measured, and familiar. He speaks of the Constitution, of applicable law, of oaths drilled into intelligence officers after Watergate, when the nation learned what happens when secrecy and authority operate without sufficient restraint. He says the right words, words that sound reassuring, words that should be reassuring. But the question lingers because the system does not run on words alone. It runs on moments when someone in the room must decide whether to comply or to refuse, whether to treat an unlawful request as merely inconvenient or as disqualifying. Slotkin presses not because she doubts the law, but because she understands pressure. She understands hierarchy. And she understands how rare it can be for someone to say no when the request comes from the very top. This is what makes this hearing matter. It is not about whether surveillance can be justified against foreign threats. That debate is long settled. It is about whether the same machinery can be quietly redirected when definitions expand and fear becomes politically useful. When national security risks becoming a catch-all phrase that justifies almost anything. The reference to new executive actions broadening the concept of domestic extremism adds another layer. Broad definitions are convenient. They require less proof, they lower thresholds, they invite mission creep. And when intelligence agencies are asked to participate in such efforts, the danger is not always overt misconduct. Sometimes it is compliance without reflection, participation without objection. Slotkin's final appeal is not accusatory. It is almost parental. Look under the rug. Make sure the people you serve never have to wonder whether the institutions meant to protect them are watching them instead. That sentence captures the quiet contract between a free society and its intelligence services. Trust is not demanded. It is earned, maintained, and protected by restraint. The second nominee's answer is shorter, clearer. Yes, he would reject an illegal or unconstitutional order. It is his responsibility. That statement lands with a certain finality, yet it also underscores the fragility of the system. Everything depends on individuals honoring that responsibility when it matters most. This hearing exposes something deeper about American governance in moments of tension. The Constitution does not enforce itself. Laws do not stand up on their own. They rely on people in powerful positions choosing principle over convenience, even when no one is watching, and especially when obedience would be easier. What we are witnessing is not paranoia. It is vigilance, the kind that democracy requires to survive its own instruments of power. Intelligence agencies are necessary. Their capabilities are extraordinary. And precisely because of that, their limits must be absolute. This moment reminds us that the most important safeguards are not technological. They are moral. They live in the decisions made behind closed doors when the pressure is highest and the cameras are gone. They live in whether leaders remember that the authority they hold was granted conditionally and can be withdrawn when abused. In an era where trust in institutions is strained, moments like this matter more than speeches or slogans. They reveal whether the system still remembers why its boundaries exist. Whether it still understands that strength is not measured by how much power can be exercised, but by how much can be restrained. A free society does not fear scrutiny. It demands it. And it survives only when those entrusted with power are willing to say no. If you believe these moments matter, support our work to expose the truth. Subscribe to Liberty Report USA.